Okay, we're recording, so no more curse words. All right, so we got the last hot tip. I'll go ahead and say it again. So joint size is often something that will change depending on what computer you open up your project in, and how to get that your joint size is under display, animation, and then joint size. And you can either use the slider to dial it up and down, or you can type in specific values. Cool. So now if I take a look at my joint hierarchy.
Will you reshare your screen?
Yes. Cool, thank you. You guys can see it again? Cool. So one thing that is very important is also when you're making rigs, gotta be a little bit persnickety about naming. Gotta be a little bit more careful. You can't just be freewheeling and dealing with polysurface 1, joint 37. That's not going to help anybody, and that's going to make your life very painful in the future. So I recommend early and often in your process, name things that you make. So I've just made 4 joints. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pause making anything, start to rename some things. So this base joint, I'm going to call wrist. And the other really helpful thing when you're making stuff is to have some kind of an ending that's unique. So where my naming convention that I usually do for rigs is I put an underscore and then type JNT if it's a joint. And I'll explain why in a second. So here, this is pointer 1. Pointer 2. And pointer 3.
Would you mind showing how to make the joint, I forgot what it's called, thing smaller?
Sure, yeah. Sorry, yeah, oh yeah, that didn't get recorded. My bad. So that is, once again, that's under display, animation, and then joint size. And that'll bring up your joint display menu. And then you can either use the dial to go up and down, or you can type in a specific value. Like that.
And when you change the size of the joint, you mentioned that does not affect the actual outcome of what it produces, correct? It's just
correct.
a visual.
That's 100% correct. Yep. And the reason that you would need that control is we're not going to get into being this crazy at the beginning, but Maya, it works in units. So whatever unit it is, that's what these numbers over here are related to. So this hand, I believe by default, Maya makes things in centimeters. So if you just open up a blank Maya project and start making things, all that stuff is going to be made in centimeters. You can
What
change...
if you press R? What does that do to it when you like increase its size and decrease its size?
Okay, when you scale it up and scale it down?
Yeah.
That's scaling it from its basically what its default transform. We're going to get into, yeah, I'll get into this much.
Sorry, yeah, finish your point, sorry.
Okay, cool. So every project you can change units at any point by opening up your preferences, which you can get at by either clicking this little sprocket guy down on the right, or you can go, if you're in Windows, you go to edit, no. Dang it, where is it in Windows? Oh yeah, so it's under Windows, and then settings and preferences, and then you can just highlight preferences. So from here, you can basically customize your project settings. One of the things you can customize is your units, your working units. Like I said, by default, Maya is in centimeters, but if you changed it to meter, then this is where your display size would come into play. So if you changed your project into meter, everything would get, if you started in centimeter, everything would get much smaller. All your joints would look microscopic, and it would be hard to work on anything. So what you could do is change the display size of your joint to be bigger, so you can actually see what's going on because you're working in a bigger unit. So yeah, you were asking about scaling and how that relates to world units. Is that right? Yes, no?
Yeah, sorry. I was just
Okay.
kind of wondering, since it like sort of starts out big.
Yeah, sure. So here is a default sphere. This sphere has any primitive that you make has this top level thing, which is called its transform. So that's the high level node. Inside of that transform, you have a couple things. One of them is the shape node, and that's why it looks like a sphere. So where the sphere is and how big the sphere is and where the sphere is rotated, it's kind of separate from what the sphere looks like. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So both this sphere and this cube have the same type of transform node. The reason that this cube looks different than this sphere is because inside of that transform node, you can see this has a polycube versus this one has a polysphere. So when you scale up a cube, you're not necessarily scaling this polycube, you're scaling the transform on top of it. So that's the node that's actually being affected. Right now, that node is set to 2 or 2.6 or whatever. At any point, you can use something called freeze transformations. And that basically gives it says to Maya that this is the new normal for this object. So if you scale something up and you're like, I don't want it to be this weird scaled up version anymore. This is actually my starting point from the cube. You can say freeze transformations by going up to modify, say freeze transformations, and see how all my values now went back to 1. So that means that this cube's default value now is going to be this big. If I scaled it back down to closer to its original size, it would be some smaller percentage of where it started out. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but I guess I just meant with the joint, when you like increase the size of like the joints with R, it like increases not like the sphere.
Oh, okay,
but,
okay,
like,
okay.
the
Yes.
triangle.
No, thank you for clarifying. So that does actually affect what's going on with the joint, because the joint is able to influence the verts afterwards based on the joint's position, the joint's rotation, and the joint's scale. So if you scaled up that joint, it would actually scale up all the verts that are associated with that joint. So it does also make the joint, does it make it look bigger? No, it doesn't make it look bigger. Okay. So it
Makes
would
the triangle bigger connected to the joint.
Yeah, it snaps back though. So like once you're done. Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. It makes that connecting point bigger. Cool. So yes, if you use scale on the joint, it is going to kind of scale up everything. So it would scale up the mesh, it would scale up the distance between the joints, it would scale all this kind of thing, which is probably not what you want. If all you want is to be able to see the joint easier, you would use display size. Cool. So now that I've taken some time, renamed some stuff, what you can do is kind of reuse some of your work and duplicate joint chains. So right now I've got 3 joints here, and if I hold Control and hit D, so I'm on Windows, so Control D. If you're on a Mac, it's Command D. What you do is you actually duplicate all 3 of those joints. So you can save a little bit of work by using this approach. And duplicate all 3 at once, kind of reposition where you want this thing. Maybe this needs to get a little bit of movement. Looks like it's in pretty good position.
When you look at those, it automatically tied itself to the wrist because
Yes.
that's the parent. Is that correct?
Yes, that is good. Thank you. Yeah, that is correct. So because I duplicated this joint is already parented to the wrist. So my new joint chain is already parented to where it should be. So these, I'm going to go ahead and rename to middle. Okay. Cool. So what I would want to do is make sure that these joints are in the right place now. You can kind of get a good feeling. So as I rotate around, I can see that little green arrow isn't quite poking out where I want it. I'm kind of hoping that it would hit this edge loop. So what I can do is just kind of push it forward, scoot it back till it's in good position there. And this joint was already pretty much in the right position. As I pivot around, it's kind of poking out this little point here. Cool. And then it's basically rinse and repeat for a hand. You can do this for as many fingers, even if your character has like 6 fingers. You kind of reuse a lot of your work as you go along. Go ahead and speed up a little bit. Ooh, okay, so here you can see that my aiming is a little bit off. Things aren't looking right. So this joint, oh, how did this joint get twisted? That's weird. So on my first joint, somehow the orientation got all janky. Put that back in place and aim that. Cool. So one important thing to note is, so now that I have done these little bits of kind of adjustment to the joint, I've got it pointing the right way. And this one, I actually want to also point out like that. So now this locator is pointing the right way. This one's pointing the right way, and this one's pointing the right way. So these two joints now have some weird little rotation, and that's not what I want. An easy way to fix that is to freeze just the rotation. So like I just showed how you can freeze rotations on the cube and it set it back to being the new normal. You want to repeat that kind of process with any joint that you put out. So this joint, now that it has this weird little Y rotation in it, what I can do is come into modify and actually click on the options box for your freeze transformation. And then pick just a specific group to freeze. And I only want to freeze the rotates. I don't want to freeze the translates or the scale. Like that. And when I hit apply, now all my rotations are set to 0 and my joint is still pointing the right way. So now when I zero out my finger, it's not going to be pointing off to the left with that weird rotation. I'll go ahead and hit apply again. Make sure that's all nice and good. We'll go ahead and delete my 2 extra fingers because those had the weird joint on them. And duplicate my new fixed set. Cool. And at this point, I'm going to beg your forgiveness and not rename everything, but know that renaming is important and that I will expect your stuff to get renamed. But in the effort to be expedient, I'm not going to go ahead and do that. But what I've got here now is all 4 of my fingers ready to go. The next and final kind of joint set is here in the thumb. And when I'm laying out the joints in this specific mesh, I would need to do a little bit of kind of rotation and creative positioning. So where a thumb bends is, your first joint isn't here. Your thumb joint, your base one, is really close to the wrist. It's all the way down there. So your first thumb kind of pivots all the way down here. So when I position my first thumb joint, I want to go ahead and position it kind of closer to the base here. And then to get the overall rotation and positioning of the thumb, I don't want to immediately jump into positioning these two, because what you can do is rotate this first joint and all your children will follow that. So I also want to, in my tool setting, which is the little hammer, you can bring up, make sure that you're set to object so you can see what direction you're pointing as you're rotating. So what I want is to have the up direction, which is now yellow. I want that to follow kind of the top topology line or the middle topology line of the thumb, which is this edge here. Right? So as I rotate my thumb joint, I'll flip back to wireframe. Move it just a little bit that way. And you can see sometimes you have to pivot around a little bit, but if you watch kind of this point and this edge loop, this is what I'm wanting to follow. You can see that that arrow is kind of sticking where it should. It's pointing out the correct direction. So now all these joints are aligned kind of with how the thumb is twisted on this model. If you're working on a different model, your thumb, the modeler might have positioned it differently. Maybe they made the thumb totally in line with everything and flattened it out. So then the rotation of your thumb is going to need to be a little bit different. So be aware of what your model looks like as you're laying out your joints so that you can limit some heartache in the future. Now that I have it pointing pretty much down, right down the barrel, I can flip to the next joint, move it to kind of the middle of this volume, and then flip to this joint, and it looks like this might be actually in the right place. Oh, maybe not quite. Select the base one last time and twist it instead of just the last joint. So all three joints are now pointing up at the same direction. So that looks pretty good. Cool. So at this point, I've got my joint deformers placed in the right location so that now I can attach my hand to the joints. And so at this phase, we're going to start to think about what's called painting weights. And this is, like I said, it's a process that takes a little bit. It's a little tricky to work with, but there are two ways of painting weights in Maya by default. One is paint mode, and the other is select mode. And I'll show an example of each of those. I think by default, Maya uses paint mode. So if you want to attach stuff, select your mesh first, holding shift, click the root joint of what you want, and then go to underneath of your rigging drop down, come over to skin, click that. And then here under bind skin, the first time you do it, I would recommend going ahead and selecting the options so you know exactly how it's attaching the skin. Joint hierarchy or bind to joint hierarchy is what I would recommend using most of the time, because what it does is it looks through the entire joint chain and it adds each of those joints to the mesh. So another option would be selected joints. And that would mean that because only the wrist is selected, only the wrist is going to affect the hand. So that's not what we want. We want all the joints to affect our mesh. So I'll flip that back to the joint hierarchy. The next couple are all kind of related to the default skinning operation. You can just leave those as they are to begin with. As you become more familiar with the process, you might prefer one to the other. Default's been working fine for me for a while. It's certainly gotten better over the years at figuring out what should be attached to what. The only one that you might want to modify is here, called max influences. So max influences basically means each vertex can be affected by a joint. How many joints do you want to be able to affect an individual vertex? Right now, I'm saying that up to 4 joints can have influence on a single vert. And what that means is, so if I have my pointer joint here, and I go like, and I'm moving my finger like that, what I'm saying is that as I bend, maybe I want a little bit of influence from the next joint to affect some of the joints around here. So that would mean that these joints would need to be able to be affected by both, so that they're not just 100% following one joint, because that is, it basically would just look like direct parenting, and you'd have these like really solid, like completely like pulling apart of the mesh. If you have multiple joints affecting a vert, then you get a little bit smoother deformation, if that makes sense. But maybe as I work on it, that'll become a little clearer. So what I've done is selected the mesh, selected the joint, go ahead and hit apply. And so it does its best guess as to what joint should be bending what thing. An easy way to start to work now is to actually go into your shading tab and say X-ray joint. And what that does is it lets you see the joints through the mesh. So now I can just easily click on the joint instead of having to kind of keep toggling back and forth between wireframe and the other mode. Okay, so let's see how it did. So with this first joint selected, if I hit the E key to activate rotate, and I rotate, you can see that that's kind of its best guess as to why it should be deforming in this way. When I rotate this joint, it's telling certain verts to move in certain ways. If you select your mesh and then hold the right click, you can drag over top of paint weights tool, and that will kind of activate the paint weights tool. And you can see over here, I can select a joint, and you can see kind of a black and white representation of what is being affected. So here, this wrist joint, you can see has very strong influence, that's what white means, over top of all these joints, and then basically no influence once you get to the end here. And all painting weights is doing the dance of what vert is affected by what joint. So the way that I actually like to start is doing big giant hunks. So I'll use a flood operation. So with this wrist joint affected, I'll turn up the opacity to 1, and I'll turn up the value to 1, and I'll just hit flood. So now the only joint that's affecting anything is this wrist joint. So if I rotate this wrist, all the hand moves. If I rotate this joint, now nothing moves anymore. Well, why that's a nice way of doing things is I come back into paint weights. You can activate a joint by either clicking on it here in the hierarchy, or right clicking over top of a joint and saying, oh, I don't think I got the joint. Right. There we go. Select influence. So if your cursor is over top of the joint, you can drag up and say select, and that will select it. So my cursor looks ridiculous right now because the brush is huge. So if I zoom out, you can actually see how big my brush area is. That's what that big circle is. So you can dial that up and down by holding B and then dragging to the left. So you can see that like that. Right? So cool. Now that my brush is a little more localized, I'll leave my opacity and value at 1. So now when I paint, I'm on the add operation, I'm adding value for influencing using this joint. So as I paint this finger, you can see it all start to move down. It looks terrible, and it's a little hard to work with. But you can eventually get there as you click. But yeah, you can see that it's a little bit painstaking and it's a little difficult to work if you're in such an extreme deformation. So what you can do is actually kind of lessen that. Go back into your paints and then make sure that you're only painting the correct birds. So you can see that because the fingers are pretty close to each other, it's actually a little tricky to paint this finger without painting this finger. So this is where I'll bring up the other way of adding weights to something, and that's using select mode. So if you go to the right click on your mesh, go to paint weights, then you do another right click on the mesh. This is where you can flip between your two modes. So right now we are on paint mode. If you go over here to select mode, it kind of looks like you've dropped out of paint weights, right? Like there's no more of that black and white representation. But what you can do at this point is actually right click again and pick a component to use for adding weights to. So what I actually like to do with things like fingers and knees and arms and stuff is use edges. So if I drag over top of edge, now when I double click these rings, and you can do multiple by holding shift and just kind of keep adding like that. So you're like, I want to affect these rings, maybe not that one because it goes all the way around. I'll be a little bit more careful once I get down to that section. So I've selected these rings. What I can do then is hold shift and click the joint that I want to be driving everything, and then use the slider here actually to say how much influence. And because I'm just blocking things out, I'm going to dial it all the way to 1, and you'll be able to see these things move as I dial up the influence, right? So it's a little bit easier to make selections by component if it's these kind of tight areas where you have these like fingers really close together. So that's why I'd recommend getting familiar with both modes. Paint mode is really nice, working on like torsos or things that are kind of far away from each other, maybe a little bit in the face. But I've actually found myself working in this mode quite a bit. So I'll go ahead and try and grab this little edge ring. My trick's not working. Dang it. Just go ahead and select them individually. You can see that it is tedious sometimes, but necessary to do. Otherwise, you would get this kind of janky deformation, right? So that's like not what you want. Once those things are selected, select the trim again, dial it up. Now they follow the joint. Cool. So now when you wiggle this finger, those verts follow that joint because you painted that influence onto that joint. And that's basically weight painting in a nutshell. You would go down and start to block out maybe some other influence. So if I got that, paint weights tool, select mode, vertex, and make sure that this joint is selected, dial this up. Now that those are good, I should be able to see, oops, these middle sections of verts will actually follow that joint and the end won't. So you can see how I still need to come into the end, that. Do the same process, paint weights, select mode, vertex, make sure that this joint is selected, dial it up. There you go. So now that follows that, and that follows that. So you can start to get a reasonable representation of how a finger deforms. But you can see there's still weirdness. Like, is that really what happens when you do that? So sometimes there's even kind of a little bit of a final pass once you've blocked everything out and like been like, this is 100% on this, this is 100% on this. Once you've got that out of the way, what you can do is often come in, flip back to paint mode and use smooth. So with smooth active, you can dial up and down like how much smoothing will happen and kind of click on these things. And Maya will kind of do its best guess to add and subtract influence based on like what is near those verts. So it kind of smooths out the deformation. So maybe this thing isn't so hard edged once you get your stuff going. So now when the end of the finger moves, there's a little bit of movement here on the underside. And I would probably come in and add in a little bit of smoothing here as well. So as this little end digit rotates, you can see like a little bit of deformation, but it basically stops once it gets into like a little bit farther away from it. Cool, so I'm gonna pause there. Now this has been a fire hose. This is the first day. We're already jumping into it. It's happening, people. There's a lot to cover, but I thought this would be a fun exercise to go through over the weekend. Don't sweat it. This is really like to try it out, to put your first deformer next to a model, to attach, to experiment with workflow for getting weights painted. Like that's what I'm really hoping can happen before we really launch into things on Monday, because there's a lot to cover, and usually the hardest couple lessons are the first 3 or 4. When you're getting familiar with the program, you're like, what the hell is going on? So just open up the program. I'll go ahead and share this with everybody at the moment. This is 11. Cool. So you should have access to this material now. You can open up or you can download Hands and open it up in Maya and start to mess around. Cool. Now let me think for 1 second. Was there one last thing that I wanted to mention before moving away from the demo? Go ahead and zero this out. Okay, yes. So I guess the final thing that will be part of kind of this first little mini project is adding in some controls. So like I said, you never want to, or you can, I would just highly recommend against putting animation on joints. So you can see now that I've gone through this process, say I painstakingly went in and painted all the weights on all the stuff, and the hand was deforming beautifully, and I could do all the awesome positioning that I wanted to if I moved the joints around. I would highly recommend against doing something like this, where I'm putting keyframe animation directly on the joints, because that is, it's just problematic. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, and then people want to edit things and it's just not very flexible with adding in additional layers of animation if you're animating directly on the joints. So what you would in fact want to do is something more like this, where you have a spline. So here under curves and surfaces, you have a couple of just default curves that you can make. And a circle is a perfectly legitimate thing to use for most stuff in a rig as a good starting point. So if you just click the little circle, it'll by default make a nerd circle. You can shrink it down and reposition it to kind of some default thing that you're wanting. So -90. So I'm going to put it around the finger. Maybe it'll be about that big. Once it's how I want it to be, I can come back here to modify, go to freeze transformations, make sure that they're all active, and hit apply. So now this thing, when it's all zeroed out, is zeros and ones. So I could position this now right on top of my joint. Oh, holding V, you can snap the joints too. So you can snap it right on top of your joint. And then what you were going to start to use are constraints. So these are basically, instead of directly parenting, which, like I said, here in the hierarchy, you can see that all of these are children of the wrist. Pointer 2 and pointer 3 are children of pointer 1, so on and so forth. The other way of getting things to follow is using a constraint. And that's located under here. And you have a couple different types of constraints. Because all I want to do is rotate these fingers, I don't want to move them, you could just use an orient constraint. So by selecting your control first, and then your joint second, you can come here to constrain and say orient. And now when I rotate, now when I rotate my joint, it actually affects here, hold on. I think I've accidentally not set one of my options. So if I select my joint, for my constraint or my control first, and then shift select my joint, and then I hit maintain offset is important because you want it to keep pointing the direction that it should be pointing, and you hit apply. Oh, it's because it's only, make sure that all is active. All right, it's a bad demo. Make sure that all is active. Right then, only Y was connected. So when I rotated it, only affected the Y axis, which is bad. So if I hit it now, you can see that there's blue markers indicating that the rotation values are actually affected. So if I select my control and I rotate it, it follows directly along with my control. And this is the thing that you actually want to do keyframe animation on. So if you hit S, you would lock in values there. You go later down the timeline, rotate, you hit S again. Those little tick marks indicate values, and it will interpolate between those. That's kind of the basics of getting a control attached and then adding some animation to that control. Cool. So in the end, or on Monday, what I would hope for everybody is that you have Maya. That's number one. Everybody is able to locate, download, and open a Maya file. That's step one. If everybody is there, I'll be happy. Step two, is kind of bonus points that you downloaded the hands project, opened it up, and started to add in joints, get them positioned. The next step beyond that would be attaching the mesh to the joints. And then step three would be painting some weights. So if you get all the way to painting weights, you're like killing it. Great job. But I don't expect everybody to get there based on kind of the intro today. Some people will just be getting familiar opening the project and looking at stuff. If you are brand new to Maya, I think I have a video, or maybe, yeah, what I'll do is in a follow-up email, I'll send out a good just intro to Maya. So just basic navigation. So being able to zoom, orbit, that's what this is, and pan are the three basic operations for moving around in your world. Some other very helpful ones is focusing. So if you clicked on something with left clicking, you can hit F and that'll zoom in on it. So if you happen to have like gone somehow, your camera went crazy and you're looking this way, you could actually select something over here in your hierarchy and hit F and it'll zoom in on it. So you can navigate a little bit quicker like that. But then just basic menu names. So outliner, channel box, modeling, attribute, tool settings, all those things, that's kind of basic Maya introductory stuff. And if you are brand new to Maya, make sure that you watch a couple YouTubes or just navigate through the program yourself and look at those things. I had, I think there was a prerequisite for this class that you needed a little bit of my experience. I understand that that's not always possible based on where you are in school. But I am kind of hoping to not have to do the intro stuff, and that I can trust that you guys will do a little bit of the intro stuff on your own if this is your first time through. Cool. Well, with that being said, I think we will end a little bit early. And oftentimes what I'll do, a couple people that have had me before will attest to this. I usually like to have 45 minutes or half an hour at the end of our scheduled class time that I will just let you guys work on whatever you're supposed to be working on. So I know that we have limited hours in the day. And if I filled up the entire class with instruction the whole time, and then you had to find time on your own to go and work on stuff, that might not be the best use of time. Also because it's hard to take in more than 2 hours of instruction anyway. Like keeping all that info in your head is a bit difficult. So for the last 45 minutes, half an hour here, we will not be on the Zoom chat, but I'm going to trust that you guys will continue to be engaged and working on things and sending any emails, or I can jump right back into a Zoom room if you have any specific questions for until at least 1 o'clock. So, you know, working, this is my attempt to duplicate in class. We would just be in class and you'd be working and I'd be going around and answering questions like, you know, as they come up. So that's kind of what I like to do for the end of the class. But before I jump off the Zoom call and keep an eye on my email or jump into individual Zoom calls, does anybody have any questions or any problems going to the shared materials link that I sent out just a second ago?
Are you gonna put this recording on in that shared folder once you send it to us?
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll actually start a new Word doc. What I do is I have hot links to my YouTube channel, and it has, that tends to be where I will put all videos. I also like to, so I'll also probably put the link to intro stuff to Maya. I'll put that on the same Google Sheet. It'll just be called like tutorials doc, and you should just be able to click that and see all the tutorial videos that I'll recommend for this class.
And you said you're going to send us the link for all the Google files in a bit.
It actually could, if somebody could check, I thought I did send it out just a second ago. Has that come through in your inbox or in anybody's inbox? Like Kirby shared a folder with you. Is that?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I just got the email for it.
Okay, cool. If that doesn't come through in the next 15 minutes or so, please let me know. Something has gone terribly wrong. It might be that I'm using your NC State email and you don't normally use your NC State email, or your NC State email doesn't feed into whatever other email you normally check. If that's the case, just email me from whatever email you normally use. Yeah, okay. Yeah, whatever, any email you normally use. It would be great if we could stick to the NC State email just because that's all linked up with your account and it makes it pretty easy for Google Drive stuff, because I think you get unlimited Google storage through Google Drive because of your NC State account. So I would recommend using your NC State email address.
Kirby, I had a question, but I guess after class ends I can ask.
Oh, no, go ahead and ask. Yeah, that's cool.
Okay.
People can listen if they want or not.
Yeah. So I guess like my one question is like in terms of like the workload, are we expecting more like a studio level or more of like just a, because I know this is more like a design elective, but like
Mhm.
how demanding, I guess, is the classwork going to be?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've been all the classes that I've taught so far are these design electives. So I see studio as, 6 hours. It's huge, and you're doing a lot of things in studio. You're learning new skills, but you're also kind of exploring topics and doing a lot of kind of what I would consider aesthetic critiques and that kind of thing, and working on your sensibilities as a designer. It's not that I don't want to focus on those things, but I think this class is going to be very clear on what I'm grading on. So this first assignment, I will be sending out the assignment description, and on there it has deliverables, which I should just be able to do a checkbox. It won't be like a subjective thing. It's like, did you put joints in a hand? Did you paint some weights? And maybe there's one section that is some kind of qualitative thing. I don't know. It depends on kind of what you guys want from me, because I could be like, well, those paint weights are pretty good, but they're really not working very well. And then you might not get full credit on that as a way of rewarding people that put in extra time and I guess just encouraging maybe that additional engagement. But that's a hard thing for me, because I'm not trying to penalize anybody with grades, just because in design, I don't know that grades are hugely helpful, because you get hired on the strength of your portfolio. And honestly, at the end of this, if what you come out with is a single 10-second animation of a character you made that's animated really well, even for like 5 seconds, that's huge. And you can use that in your portfolio. But it's really just that one thing. And maybe all the other stuff like your hand assignment or a constraints project that I come up with, those aren't as applicable, and you don't put those in your portfolio. You can still get a job using the other thing. So I don't know. Like I very much look at it as this is hopefully going to give you something that you can show somebody and be proud of it. But I also don't want somebody to feel like they've been, shorted on any front because they put in a ton of time and they made all their projects awesome, and this other person just focused on one thing and didn't even turn in 3 projects, and you get the same grade. Like, is that fair? I don't know.
Yeah, because I asked that because I'm at the point where like my credit hours are like, I'm running out of classes to take, so I'm debating whether or not I want to take this class now or save it for next semester to remain a full-time student. Gotcha. So like my idea is like, oh well, like if I have 2 design classes that are already like that involve my involvement like pretty high, like kind of like 2 studios, I don't want to take this class and not do as well as I would like to because I'm like stretched so thin. So that's kind of like why I bring it up.
I see. Yeah, and I would very much leave that kind of in your hands as far as the amount of engagement, because the amount of information and tutorials and experimentation that you could do, it is endless, in my opinion. You basically put in as many hours as you want. It's basically what you want out of the class. So, for example, in this first assignment, if you've never rigged a hand before, you could approach it as checking off the 3 boxes I mentioned: make joints, skin joints, add some controls. And then you could also approach it as, I'm going to look up how Pixar animators model their hands. I'm going to look up specific joint placement and tricks for that. Like, you can go into serious depth and do it that way. That's what's important to you. But to your point, it's very much kind of outside of what I will expect of you. I'm going to expect, this baseline that I'll outline in the project description. And if you go above and beyond, all that does is benefit you as a designer. But I don't know that it would get you more of a grade if that's what you're looking for.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I have another question related to the shared file. For some
Uh-huh.
reason, it's only showing the one document, the hands document that you put in. Is that all that's in there right now?
Yeah, that's all that's in there right now. I'll drop in the tutorial doc after class, and then the project description as well. All that should be in there.
Thank you.
Mhm. Cool. I guess I could do a little bit of a show and tell. So recently, I've been, I guess, really getting back into more 2D animation, but all the time I've spent getting good at 3D and learning tips and tricks. I wanted to take advantage of some of the awesome parts of that, which is like staying on model when you're doing 2D animation is really hard. Perspective and all that kind of stuff is really hard. So I've been messing around with making, actually I should feel this, making a renderer in Maya that will render out just the lines. And my thinking is that you could take that as a basis for like doing 2D animation. So your first pass could be rendering out lines in Maya, and then you could edit them in Photoshop, and then compile them all in After Effects. Let me open up what I'm talking about. Cut out. Or maybe I deleted it. No, maybe I deleted it.
It's in the email you sent me if you just want to play the GIF.
Oh yeah, there you go. Ah, there we go. Cool, thanks. Yeah, my other favorite thing to do is work on something and delete it. It's very cathartic. Not be precious. So here I had made like a 3D model that's all rigged in Maya, and put a cowboy hat and a mustache on him, and then did some rendering tricks. So all it's detecting is edges, and then spit that out as its own individual file. So these purple lines are actually rendered out of Maya. And then I bring those frames into After Effects, and I do some trickery to make them look like hand-drawn lines, and then also adjust the frame rate to be more of a hand-drawn frame rate, which is 10 to 12 frames per second. And in the end, it kind of starts to look a little bit like hand-drawn animation. It's still very smooth because it's Maya, and my 3D animation, you can really hit your mark. But other cool things is like using techniques to do kind of a shading pass where you only have a one-tone shadow. So he's all yellow except for some like little bits of darker yellow. So what you could do is shoot out another render pass where your shadow is just one color, and it's that solid line, and then treat those colors in After Effects. You can say the white is going to be yellow, and then the black is going to be a little bit darker yellow. So you can start to kind of get that anime type feel where it's that single cell shading look. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've been messing with in personal projects. And I hope this year I've made a goal to make an animation for myself instead of just for work. Because that's surprisingly difficult. I've missed it the past 2 years. Well, cool. It was very good to meet everybody. And like I said, I'll be adding in those 2 more files to the shared folder. So you should be able to, not that you need the project description for Monday. I would just, like I said, download the hands file, mess around with things as much as you can. But the other thing that's going in there, which is the video tutorial document, I would recommend checking back in just a little bit, make sure those links work if you are brand new to Maya, just so you can have a link to a video that can walk you through the interface and that kind of stuff. Well, cool. Thanks, guys. And I will awkwardly sign off because I've never figured out a smooth way to step out of a Zoom call. It's always like, all right, well, bye then.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
later. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You too.
No.